Thank you very much. Let me start with a quote. 3 months ago, the following statement was made, and I quote, "The Ukraine crisis is the most serious crisis in Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Russia's annexation of the Crimea is a wake-up call for the Euro-Atlantic community, for NATO, and for all those committed to a Europe whole, free, and at peace." Well, I don't know whether you recognize it. Perhaps it could have been said by anyone, but the speaker was NATO Secretary General Rasmussen last March. Let me get this straight. So the skirmishes, the annexation of Crimea, current civil unrest, civil war in eastern Ukraine is the most serious crisis in Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So is it more serious than the Balkan Wars we had in the 90s? I'm not sure. Is it more serious than the massive euro crisis we are still faced with today? I think word on the street would be no. People are massively losing their jobs. So let me choose my words very carefully. I think this is a very dangerously wrong assessment of the situation we're in today. And I think the reason why the Ukraine crisis is framed in the way it is can be found in the second part of Rasmussen's statement, where he argued, and I quote, "Crimea is a wake-up call for NATO." Well, you've heard from Maurice that NATO falls asleep after 6 months after Georgia, but there are a few other indications where I would say, well, keep awake, keep really your eyes open. NATO needs to be woken up. I think this is rather a surprising statement. So it's not the crisis in Syria or Libya or Mali or Afghanistan, and even not today in Iraq, that can wake NATO up. What is needed, according to this statement, is something right on NATO's very doorstep, so that we can have a debate about the contemporary relevance of Article 5, movement of troops towards Europe, whether it's in BRICS or in exercises, as Jamie suggested. But in short, what is needed for NATO to really keep it on its toes is good old traditional NATO stuff, the kind of stuff we've been debating for decades during the Cold War, and which is now revisited actually at this very conference, this very seminar. Let me now offer you another quote, and this statement was made by Helmut Schmidt. He's the former German Chancellor, and he said the following just a few months back. He said, "I don't like to conjure up the idea of a third world war, especially not if this is done to get more money to rearm NATO. The danger that things will escalate as it did in August 1914 increases day by day." Well, I personally don't think that this crisis will escalate. To be very honest, of course we were very worried, and we are still worried about what happened in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. But if you now just take today's newspapers as your guideline, Ukraine has already moved to, well, which page? Which sort of item is it on the daily 8 o'clock news? We sort of get used to even tens of casualties on a daily basis. I'm not saying that we should, but we do. For me, the Ukraine crisis is and should not be seen as a so-called game changer. Anyone who knows Russia a little bit should not have been surprised that this has happened. The simple fact that Russia has its own Monroe doctrine is normal. I don't think it's nice, I don't like it, it's certainly not optimal, but it's also not something very exceptional. The Monroe doctrine, of course, is from the United States. It has been into, let's say, function for a very long time, since the mid-19th century. So we should not be surprised that Russia has not got the message, and certainly not because it has not really overcome its post-imperial trauma. And if you look at Ukraine, let's be honest, Ukraine is the kleptocracy, just like Russia to some extent is. And it has been stealing Russian gas for decades. If we don't want to acknowledge that, then I think we are fooling ourselves. To some extent, it is quite normal that Russia is also fed up with Kiev's irresponsible behavior. And I think we should also acknowledge that Russia has asked, somewhat politely, for a long time, since at least 2008, to be much more involved in Europe's security architecture. You remember President Medvedev's suggestion to have this overhaul, at least recalibration of Europe's security institutions. This was in 2008. I think we have not taken this seriously at all. We have assumed that Russia would come to terms with reality as we were in the West trying to shape it, through enlargement of the European Union and NATO. And to a very large extent, you could say that the association agreements which the European Union offered towards Ukraine has been for Russia the last straw. So again, is it a surprise? No. Is it something which I like? Also no. But I think we should acknowledge Russia as it is and not as we think it should be. So what does that mean for NATO? Let me be very concrete. I think, given the greater picture of strategic issues we have in the world, we should really quickly mend fences with Russia, as quick as possible. We should refrain from further, provocations. We can debate what it actually means towards Russia. We should perhaps think about the kind of Finlandized solution for Ukraine, given the reality as it is. We're not willing to make Ukraine a member of NATO. I think I'm saying nothing new. This is not on the cards in the next 10 years or so. EU membership, I don't think Ukraine can actually handle. So what is the reality of Ukraine's strategic position? It's something in between, as actually the name of the country indicates itself. So there are three reasons, I think, for doing so. First, I think we need Russia to become an integral part of the Western value-based community. Putin's Russia is far removed from the barbaric police state the Western press makes it out to be. I don't think this is true. On the contrary, I think contemporary Russia has many aspects to become still, regardless or despite everything which we've seen over the last year, a political ally in many respects. Second, we need Russian support on very many occasions, today and in the future. From Syria to the Middle East, from dealing with WMD proliferation and many other security issues. We should also not forget that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Again, these are realities. We should work with them. We can't ignore them. We can't wish them away. I think it's important to take them into account. If you look at the world in terms of realist chess games, that's fine. Ukraine is one chess board. But there are many others in the world. And I think we should acknowledge that Russia plays an important part in these different strategic equations. Lastly, we should acknowledge that Russia is perhaps moving towards China. That China and Russia could become partners in a much more different way than just economically, but also strategically. Would we like to see this happening? We always talk about a rising China. If this would also be a China linking up strategically with Russia. I'm not sure this will happen, but if you look at the recent gas energy deals with Russia and China, I think it's an opportunity and a possibility. So, NATO needs to be wise and not take any drastic measures at the Wales Summit. Yes, NATO needs to wake up, but it also needs to wake up to the fact that it needs Russia as a potential ally and certainly not as a new enemy. Is this going to happen? Well, I'm not sure. Most likely we'll hear the usual rhetoric of NATO. Well, I'm not writing these communiques, but they will take bold and decisive action. They will show resolve and transatlantic solidarity. I'm pretty sure that's the kind of terminology that we'll see. We also expect that they need to acknowledge that the gap between rhetoric and action, between words and political will, should not be too big.
To what extent should we be willing to keep Russia as a strategic partner for NATO?
Well, I think this will be a very difficult question. At the moment, of course, we see Russia as a kind of enemy or antagonist, but there will be future scenarios. Think about, for example, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, if the whole nuclear non-proliferation treaty breaks down, that we need Russia. And there will be several other occasions. So it's not a matter that we take only moral or ethical choices. Sometimes we're inclined to do so. But we need to look ahead, just beyond the horizon, and see that we need Russia, whether we like it or not. So if you take that into account, we need to basically make clear to Russia that what it has done is unacceptable, that we should not antagonize Russia and harm our relation with Russia any more than is absolutely necessary for this reason.
You mentioned that we should try to make Russia part of the Euro-Atlantic community. How should we do this?
Well, we don't have a simple strategy. Ultimately, it's up to Russia whether they want to join our value community or not. But again, what I said earlier, it's important to realize that Russia in the broader community of nations is probably much closer to us than many other allies which we have, like Saudi Arabia, for example. Russia is part of Western culture. It's part of our continent. We have very intensive people-to-people contact with Russia. So what we need to make clear is that Russia's destiny as a people, as a culture, is very much linked to the culture of the West. And I'm talking basically about European culture. This is not just a matter of history, it's something which is reality today. And what it offers in this respect is perhaps a little bit of pride to Russia, and something which they can use to look ahead. It's something which they can use to give Russia a proper European vocation. And that's something which is very important because it's not just Europe which is luring, it's also China. And perhaps Russia has a choice. Should we go towards a rising China or should we go towards Europe? And at the moment, Russia does not offer tremendous economic advantages, but perhaps it can offer exactly this value-based community which Russia has a better place in.
Looking at what defense ministers discussed earlier this month, I mean, Poland came forward with this commitment towards increasing its defense spending to the 2% guideline. We're hearing similar things from other countries, from Latvia, Lithuania, Romania. So there is an opportunity for this summit to bring a positive message on this, and certainly from Washington, a much needed message, especially indeed if we do have a discussion in Congress on this 1 billion European reassurance initiative. This is a must. So that actually, from my perspective, and you certainly don't see anything coming from NATO in terms of even questioning, but that does pose a number of questions. What about this Europe whole and free and at peace? You know, what about this partnership that is meant to be inclusive? If you have a Russia that's actually not playing that game, what is that going to do to our whole approach to partnership? I mean, does it mean that NATO's model of partnership is broken? Does it mean that we need to review the principles of partnership? It's not only about NATO-Russia. It's about, you know, what do you do with countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova? You know, how do you approach this when you now know that you no longer have Russia in the tent? And in fact, a broader question. You know, we have been, the alliance actually has been riding the what I would call partnership enlargement tandem for the better part of the last 20 years. I mean, this is actually the vision. But you know, partnership was developed only because we had Russia in the tent. It had to proceed in tandem. You know, there was not going to be any enlargement or partnership without Russia developing its own relationship with NATO. Now we know this is not only not delivering, but it's not in dire need of reviewing. And you know, what does that mean? I mean, don't get me wrong, I think that partnership is still strong, and I think that, you know, the Ukraine comprehensive package of measures that was developed post-February is resting on the tools of partnership, and you know, it's about defense reform assistance, it's about modernization of armed forces and greater interoperability with partner forces. So there's no doubt that partnership is a crucial instrument when it comes to assisting reform, when it comes to spreading stability, when it comes to preparing for membership. But again, you know, how do you go beyond that? I mean, what is the vision going to be in this new European environment when it comes to NATO-Russia, but I mean more broadly, NATO partnership? I don't think that actually Russia understood cooperative security ever. I think that we don't know how to play that game, as we've heard from Tom and Stan, but I actually think that Russia is incapable, just doesn't get cooperative security. So a new set of rules, a new division of labor, that brings me to my conclusion. I think that looking at this summit, NATO is probably on the right path and in good shape when it comes to its internal adaptation vis-a-vis the new environment, be it in terms of transatlantic boundary, in terms of collective defense crisis management. I think NATO knows how to adapt. NATO is eminently flexible, has proven so in the last 15 years. But I think that NATO is looking at a much more challenging situation when it comes to its external adaptation, its partnership enlargement policies. And I'll conclude on that.